the level of Maser Sheni. We had the level of Truma, Kodesh, and Mechatat. Those are the 5 levels that the Mishnah counted in the Resha of the Mishnah. And now the Gemara says, Shema Mina, Amar Rab Mari. Rab Mari taught, Shema Mina, Chulin Shnasu al Taharat HaKodesh. If you keep your Chulin al Taharat HaKodesh, that means there were people who, when even they ate Chulin, they treated it like Kodesh, Mamash, as if you're eating regular sandwich, and you dealt with it as though this is Mamash Basar Shalamim of Kochim. You kept it from every level of Tum'ah possible, as though you were a Kohen eating Kochim. So says the Gemara, you see from our Mishnah that if you are careful with your Chulin, Al Taharat HaKodesh, Kekodesh Damu, that makes it as though this Chulin was Kodesh. That means now, if it touches Kodesh and so on and so forth, it would be no problem, because this has been dealt with like Kodesh. It stays in the status of Kodesh as far as Tum'ah Ta'ara is concerned. So says the Gemara, Mimai, from where do you see that in our Mishnah, that this is like Kodesh? And says the Gemara, very simple, because in the accounting of the Mishnah, there's only 5 levels mentioned, but not more. Because it does not have its own ma'ala. It doesn't say in the Mishnah Chulin that were in the level of Chulin, and they're Chulin. Chulin that they were in the level of Kodesh. That means if you were careful to eat your Chulin al Taharat HaKodesh, then it's going to be the 2nd level, and then it's going to be a Chulin or Maser Sheni, and then Teruma, and that's not 6 levels. There's only 5 levels. So either Chulin or Teruma, Maser, Teruma, Kodesh, Mechatat. It doesn't have its own thing. So says the Gemara, that's not a proof. Since when that serves as a proof? It may just be that regular Chulin, that you are careful with them, Al Taharat HaKodesh, to treat them as though they were Kodesh, maybe they are considered either like Chulin or like Teruma. And whether they're considered Chulin or Teruma, both of those levels are mentioned in our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, they're mentioned the levels of Chulin and the levels of Teruma and the levels of Maser. So all of those possibilities are mentioned in the Mishnah. That's why it doesn't mention. Says the Gemara, let's read it inside. V'dilma, the first top line. V'dilma hay delo katani be'uma'alam. Maybe, just maybe, the reason that our Mishnah does not count it as its own ma'ala, as its own level, is because the idami le teruma, hakatani teruma. If it is like teruma, then our Mishnah discusses teruma. It's there. It's one of the 5 levels that the Mishnah discusses. And if it is considered chulin, ve'idamu lechulin, hatani lechulin. Our Mishnah also discusses chulin. So in other words, Rabbi Mari wanted to suggest that when you are careful with your regular food, as though you are eating kochim, then they become like kochim. If they touch kodesh, there's going to be no problem. And the reason is because the Mishnah does not discuss any other additional levels. That was the suggestion of the Gemara for now. The Gemara says that's not a correct suggestion, because maybe, and we're going to see just in a second, there are 2 shitas in the Tanaim that we know of, that one of them holds a chulin that you were careful with is like chulin, and the other one holds a chulin that you were careful with is like teruma. So whether it is like chulin or it's like teruma, still is not like kodesh. If it touches kodesh, what's going to happen? If it comes in contact with kodesh, you're in trouble. And maybe our Mishnah also holds like one of those 2 shitas, And the reason that it does not count it as its own level is because those two levels are explicitly mentioned in our Mishnah. Right? So you have Chulin, you have Master, you have Teruma, and you have Kodesh and Mechatat. And the Chulin that you were careful and mindful with, Al Taharat HaKodesh, has one of those levels. But you don't see from our Mishnah so far that if I was careful with my Chulin to keep them like Kochim, that now they have the status of Tahara of a Kodesh. Right? That you don't see, says the Gemara. So therefore, the Gemara wants to suggest now, from the Resha of the Mishnah, you see nothing. And the Gemara is going to prove it from the Sefer of the Mishnah. But let's read it now, what we explained already. The Mishnah says, if a person was careful with their regular sandwich, regular food, like Al Taharat HaKodesh, like they as though they were dealing with Mamash Basar Shalamim Kodesh, says the Mishnah, Harehen Kechulin, they're like Chulin. Doesn't make much of a difference. This is one Shita in Tanaim. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Tzadok Omer, the second Shita who disagrees with that holds, Harehen Kitruma. They're not like Chulin, but they're like Truma. So they are a higher level, but they're not like Kodesh. They're lower level than Kodesh. Their status of Tahara is higher than Chulin, but lower than Kodesh. So says the Gemara, Ela Misefa. So therefore, Gemara says, Rav Mari, who at the last line of Yutet Amud Bet suggested that from our Mishnah you see that if you're careful with your Chulin, it has this, it maintains the status of Tahara of Kodesh. He could not have learned this from the beginning of our Mishnah. He learned it from story that the Mishnah said later on. And that is the following. Yossi ben Yoezer, we learned that Yossi ben Yoezer was a Chasid Shebekeuna. So he ate some of the foods that Kohanim used, but some of them Kodesh he did not use. Right? Because he never ingested and consumed Kodesh, his mitbachat, his begadim were considered a source of tum'ah for Kodesh. That means if his begadim, his garments that he wore, came in contact with Kodesh, that would be trouble. Even though that he was careful to was careful very much in the levels of teruma. And now here is the punchline. Says the Mishnah, Yochanan ben Gudkeda, Haya ochel al taharat hakodesh, kol yamav. This individual, his entire life, he dealt with his chulin, with his regular Tuesday afternoon sandwich, like basar shelamim. Always careful to eat chulav al taharat hakodesh. Every chulin that he consumed and he dealt with, he imagined in his mind, this is mamash like kodesh. And he maintained a level of tahara needed for kodesh. And says the Mishnah, and here's the punchline. And yet, because he only was careful and mindful of a level of tahara of kodesh, his bigadim would have been midras would have been source of tumah, rather, for a person that was going to be dealing with mechatat of efer paraduma, right? And says the Gemara, listen to what the Mishnah is saying. This fellow is not touching kodesh. He's eating his Tuesday afternoon sandwich, but he's careful al taharat kodesh. He's careful the level of tahara of kodesh. And says the Mishnah, his begadim are only a problem if you would want to deal with mechatat. That means his begadim would not have been a problem if you would have dealt with actual kodesh. So you see from here that chulin shenasu al taharat kodesh ke kodesh tamu. right? You see what Rabbi Mari wanted to infer from our Mishnah comes from this story of Yochanan ben Gudgada that was careful eating chulin al Taharat HaKodesh, and our Mishnah is muchach, is clear that would be sufficient, that now if he came in contact with actual Kodesh, it would be completely fine. And hence, chulin shenasu al Taharat HaKodesh, Kodesh dam would become the same exact identical level of tahara as Kodesh, and a person that was careful to eat their chulin, the Taharat HaKodesh, they could touch even Kodesh and will be fine. So says the Gemara, we explained it, we're just going to read the words. So his mitpachat would be a source for chatat. Lechatat in lekodesh lo. It would only be a problem for chatat, but it would not have been a problem for kodesh, and therefore alma kasavar chulin shnasu al taharat hakodesh ke kodesh damu. That chulin that were dealt with mindfully, as though they were kodesh, they become, they maintain, we should say, the level of tahara of kodesh, and therefore, if you touched kodesh, it will be fine.
What is the point of showing Yossi ben Yoezer's the statement about him? What does that teach us? I mean, you could have just brought Yochanan ben Gudgada.
Good question. Amar Rabbi Yonatan ben Elazar. Rabbi Yonatan ben Elazar says, Nafla ma'afarto emenu. Oh, the Gemara is going to show two levels of additional chumrah that we have. Two levels of additional chumrah that we have about keeping mindset of tahara, that if you have what we call hesach hadat, if you take your mind off of the shmirah, the guarding of the level of tahara that you're being mindful of, that shmirah is gone. And now you're to deal with it as it became tameh, even though that he may not have, but that's a chumrah that we maintain in the guarding of the levels of tahara. How so? There are two levels, says the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yonatan ben Elazar. Rabbi Yonatan ben Elazar said, Nafla ma'afarto emenu. If his garment, he had something on him, he was wearing something, and he fell from him. Now, imagine, all of this is in front of him. He just fell on the ground, right? Nothing was on the ground necessarily. Your friend is there, and your friend is careful in tahara also. He's not an amaretz. Your friend also is considered a chaver. Chaver in our sugya of taharot means a person that is careful, zahir, in tumah v'tahara. So your friend is there. You tell your friend, can you please pick this up and give it back to me, right? My hands are full. Can you please give it to me? And he picks it up and gives it to you. Says the Gemara, the beket now is tameh. Right? Let's read this through and explain it. If your garment fell off, the person says to his friend, Tenali, please pick it up and give it to me. And he picks it up and gives it to him. Why? Because the person, the friend who's picking this up, he doesn't know if this guy is keeping that level of tahara. He doesn't know. And therefore, he is not keeping that extra level of tahara in his mind. And hence, in his mind, there's no shmirah. So let's call them Reuben and Shimon. Shimon, who picked it up from the ground, is not shomer, is not careful with this garment because he doesn't know that Reuben is keeping this to this high level of tahara. So you say, well, but Reuben it's right there. It's in there in the same room. Says the Gemara, no, because we have a chazakah that a person who is not actually handling something, they are not careful unless they really are being mashgiach on it. But if you just trust the other person, say, can you pick this up and give it to me? And you know that this person is normally careful with taharot, you basically take your mind off of it. That's called hesach hadat. You're not a mashgiach now. You're not actively guarding it. And while you're not actively guarding it, is hesach hadat. So you're not keeping it. He is not keeping it because he doesn't know your levels of tahara. Who's keeping it? Nobody. So that is considered hesach hadat. There's a vacuum of mindfulness over there, of hashgacha over there, and that is a chumrah in the levels of tahara that we consider it as if it was lost, and therefore is no longer to be assumed as tahor. Now, you think this is bad. Says the Gemara, there's another level of hesach hadat that we're going to assume one way, then the Gemara is going to fall off of it soon in the process of the future lines. The Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yonatan ben Amram. Rabbi Yonatan ben Amram, who is mentioned one more time in Shas, to my knowledge, it's a story, actually a very interesting story in Masechet Ba'abat Daf Chet. There, the Gemara discusses a time of famine, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was very wealthy, right? The Gemara in Abu Dazara says, Itafyud Yud Aleph, Gemara says how rich he was and how close he was to Antoninus, the emperor, so to speak, of Rome, and he would send him, carriages and carriages of gold in hiding. The emperor would send to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. He was a tremendously rich individual, and he had a kupat tzedakah in the years of famine to feed the aniyim, but he had the criteria. You had to be some sort of a learned person for him to prioritize you, right? So the Gemara says, Yonatan ben Amram goes to him, and Rabbi gives him a faher. It gives him a test. It says, Beni, my son, did you learn Mikra? He says, no. He says, did you learn Mishnah? He says, what's Mishnah? Right? He says, so didn't even bother with the Gemara. He says, so how do you want me to feed you? Right? You haven't learned anything. What schut do you have? And he says a very sharp answer to him. He says, Rabbi, parneseni kakelev orev. Like, feed me like HaKadosh Baruch Hu also feeds the dogs in the ravens. So feed me. You would. So that was a winning that was a winning argument. So he gave it to him, and then afterwards, when he left, he felt bad. He's like, I supported an Amaharetz. I could have given it to Talmid Chacham, and they tell him, no, maybe this person is an undercover Talmid Chacham. Look at the argument he made. Maybe this is the famous Talmid that you have. Back then, they had so many Talmidim, they didn't even know probably their identity one by one. So he says, maybe this is Yonatan ben Amram Talmidecha, that he has accepted that never he's going to benefit from Kavod Torah. That's why when you hinge the support on knowledge of Torah, he doesn't want to say that he has knowledge of Torah. Maybe that's him, and they look and say it was him. So this is we're talking about the person that's Sanua. The Gemara there goes to say that Rebbe changed his policy after that, and so on. A very interesting Gemara over there in Baba Batra in the very beginning. But here is Yonatan ben Amram. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yonatan ben Amram, Nitchalfu lo kelim shel Shabbat bekelim shel Chol. You go to your closet and you want to wear your regular weekday clothing, and unbeknownst to you, you wear your Bigdei Shabbat. You take the wrong clothing now. You're mindful. You're the same person. You haven't handed it to somebody else. It's just that you think you have suit number one, and you really have suit number two. So you don't know which one you're wearing. And that is considered a little bit of a lack of that, because you think you have this, but you really have that. And says Yonatan, this is what we think right now. This is what the Gemara thinks it means now. At this stage, we're going to fall off of this understanding right now, that we have right now, later on in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, so nitchalefulo kelim shel Shabbat bekelim shel Chol. He wore the other way around. In other words, he thinks that he's taking the weekday clothing, and he by mistake took his Shabbat clothing. Velevashal nitmeu. That's because they're considered tameh. Now, according to the current understanding, which again, we're going to fall off of this, but according to the current understanding, I ask you a question. If it would be reverse, if you would think that this is my Bigdei Shabbat, and then by mistake you took Bigdei Chol, what would be the din? Same halacha, right? Because it's a lack of mindfulness, which we call it's a buzzword, but it's a lack of clear knowledge of what I'm wearing, and that doesn't make a difference if it's Shabbat, Chol, Shabbat makes no difference, according to the current understanding of the Gemara, which we're going to fall off from. So says Gemara, Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Sadok. Rabbi Elazar ben Sadok says another story indicating the same thing. There were two women, chaverot, that means they were the wives of chaverim. They were the wives of people who were careful in Tumah V'Tahara, so hence they're also careful in Tumah V'Tahara. They went to the public bathhouse, and when coming back, their locker was next to each other, so each one of them wore the other one's clothing without knowing. Right? So that's the same thing. You think you're wearing this garment A, but you're really wearing B, and vice versa. So says the Gemara, they came to ask the she'ela in front of Rabbi Akiva. This is the she'elot that they used to ask back then. Like, we're stuck with much lower level questions. So they came to ask this question to Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva says, Tameh. Not good. So now, again, the Gemara now is thinking, the reason is why? Because the lack of awareness. You think that this is that garment and it's not that garment, it's not good enough. That's what we think right now. So says the Gemara, Matkif la Rabbi Oshaya. Rabbi Oshaya asked on this two last shitas that we had, Rabbi Elazar bar Sadok and Rabbi Natan ben Amram, who now we know is a Talmud of Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Elamata says, according to your logic, do you want to suggest that Hoshit Yadol Esal, and if you stick your hand into a basket and you want to get patritin, you want to get a wheat flour, and in the basket there are all kinds of different items, and by mistake you take patzorim, barley flour, barley bread, and you take it out. Now it's tameh because you were holding something that you didn't know you're holding. You want to suggest that? You want to suggest that becomes tameh because of that? If you want to say that hachinami, that it becomes tameh, it can't be. We learned in the Braita. המשמרת החבית בחזקת של יין ונמצאת של שמן טהורה מלטמא. That if you are guarding your mashgiach over a barrel of wine, but you think it's wine, it actually turns out to be oil. So you thought that you're keeping some wine over here, it ends up being oil. Same seems like it's the same case. It's lack of awareness of what you are dealing with, and yet says the Braita, it is te'ora miletameh. It's tahor, it does not make anything tameh. So says the Gemara, tameh according to you, emasefa. Take a look at the halacha in the bottom of that same Braita. The halacha at the bottom of the same Braita says emasefa ve'asura milechol. It is asur to eat it. It does not make it tameh, but you can't eat it. Right? You all remember that we mentioned a difference between tameh and pasul. Remember that? Tameh means something that becomes tameh itself, and it's a level of tumah that could now go ahead and make something of its own nature tameh again. So, for instance, a kodesh that becomes shlishi tumah, we call it tameh because not only it itself is tameh, but if you touch another kodesh with that, the other kodesh becomes revi'i letumah, which exists by kodesh. But if had it been just truma that becomes shlishi letumah is the last stop of levels of tumah. You touch another terumah with it, nothing happens, right? It doesn't become Revi'i because Truma doesn't have Revi'i, right? So it says the bright over here, it is tahor from being tameh. That means it's not tameh to make something else tameh. But it says the Gemara, but look at the end. The end says you can't eat it. Asura milechol, you cannot eat it. Amai, says the Gemara, why? Amar Yirmiyam, be'omer shmartia midavar hametameh velo midavar haposla. I said, no, that's not a problem. It's not a problem of Shemirah. The Shemirah is a good Shemirah. The watching, even though that you didn't know that this barrel is containing shemen, you thought it's containing yayin, that still is a good Shemirah. You know why you can't eat it? Because the guy is telling you, I watched this from anything that could make it tameh. But I didn't watch it from something that could make it pasul. So therefore, we are to deal with it as something that's pasul, hence you can't eat it. But it's not tameh that if it comes in contact with something else, it will make it tameh or pasul, right? That's what it means. But the shemirah, the guarding, it's good. Even though that you didn't know what it actually contains, what the content of the barrel is. So therefore, we're back to our question, right? The original question. You can't say that if I am wearing garment A and I think it's garment B, that it should become tameh. Because here, you think you're guarding drink A and you're really guarding drink B, and it's tahor. Your shemirah is a good shemirah. It's not a problem. So that's the actual acrobatic question of the Gemara. But then the Gemara pauses for just 1 second and says, wait a second. Did you just say that you could keep something from this level of tum'ah, but not for that level of tum'ah? I mean, are you a guard or are you not a guard? It's like as if you have a security guard that says, I'm not letting any terrorists from Taliban, but the Hamas people, I'm not watching. I mean, if you're watching the door, you're watching the door. If you're watching this barrel, you're watching the barrel. How in the world can you say, well, I watched it from something that's high level tum'ah that will make it tameh, but I wasn't really careful for a lower level tum'ah that will make it only pasul. Do you have shemirah lechatzai? Do you have such a thing as halfway shemirah? You have a shemirah lechetzi? Do you have such a concept as keeping something halfway? The Gemara says, yes, you do. And I prove it to you. We have a brighter that says it. If you extend your hand into a basket, you're keeping this sal, this basket on your shoulder, and you have this magrefa. Magrefa was a metal piece, it's like a squeegee, but they used to use it was metal. They used to use it for cleaning off the tanur, right? In tanur, you let fire and it creates ashes. So before you lit it on next time, you have to, sweep out clean off the ashes, and that's what they used to use, magrefa. But they also used it for cutting and separating igule de vela, the pressed pieces of figs together, the fig rolls, so to speak. They used to cut through them and open them with magrefa. So you have this sal, this basket, with the content inside of it, and inside of it is also a magrefa. But all of them are in the same sal. You're carrying it literally on your shoulder. So you're watching it, right? You're carrying this thing on your shoulder. So says the Braita clearly, you were mindful, you were careful of the tzal. You didn't know about the magrefa. You weren't thinking about the magrefa that's inside the tzal. Hasal tahor v'hamagrefa temea. The basket is tahor. The magrefa is tameh. They're inside each other. The magrefa is inside the sal. How can you have like a 50% shmirah when you're talking about the thing itself? So says the Gemara, you see that you have shmirah lechatzayim. You have a halfway shmirah. But then Gemara asks some practical questions. So wait a second. If the magrefa is tameh, so let the magrefa make the tzal tameh, because it's touching it. Says the Gemara, no. En keli metameh keli. We have a rule: a keli cannot make another kli tameh. V'litameh mashe betzal, and let the magrefa that you say it's tameh, like this piece of metal, kli, let it make the figs tameh, right? The content tameh. Says the Gemara, v'litameh mashe betzal, amar Ravina beomer shemartiv midavar shemetameo velo midavar haposlo. We were talking about the case that the guy carrying the basket said, well, I was careful with this magrefa, or the content of the sal, the content of the basket, from anything that could make it tameh in a level that would make something else tameh, but I was not careful with the lower level of tumah that would only make it pasul. So you see, our question of shemirah lechetzi, of a halfway shmirah, is actually mentioned black and white in this bright up, that you see you can have a person keeping something from a lower level, higher level of tumah, but not from a lower level of tumah. And then the Gemara says, Mikol makom kasha, we still have our question. In other words, the question that we had before on the two Tanaim, the two shitas that we mentioned before in the Gemara, that you see, if you have this in mind, but not the other one in mind, it should be tahor. And the Gemara, because of this question, is going to fall off of our understanding in a fascinating Gemara, which will really conclude the Perek Sheni, the second Perek of Chagigah, which Bezrat Hashem we will continue in the days to come.